Is Krissy Clark, and I just got my clicker. I am a narrative geologist. If you've never heard of that phrase, that's because I just made it up. I am also, as Brady mentioned, a journalist and a documentary maker and the Los Angeles bureau chief for KQED Public Radio. And I'm here to tell you some stories about place, including the story of a vision that I had in the desert. I'll get to that one in a moment. I'm going to tell you these stories because I think stories and the wonder they can inspire are a big part of location. This conference is focused on the technology and the business of location primarily, and those things are hugely important, but for location to really matter, it also needs something else. It needs stories that help make meaning out of a place and that help make meaning out of all of the information that a location-aware device can now unleash onto a place. So story number one. Once upon a time, in 1848, my great-great-grandfather came here to the Bay Area on a mule. And the result of having so much family history in one place is that as a kid, whenever we would drive anywhere, my dad would point out the window at the places we went by and say, that used to be that. That wind farm used to be the site of your great-great-grandfather's general store. That highway leading up to the Golden Gate Bridge used to be the world's coolest jungle gym. My dad claims to have actually climbed up it when it was under construction. I don't know if I believe him, but what I do know is that over the course of these car trips, I came to realize that a landscape is actually made up of stories, layer upon layer, like geologic strata. And that's what inspired me to become a journalist, to find those stories and to share them in the hopes that we can all understand the world better. Because I think that the more that we understand about the places that we move through each day, the more care we take in those places and the more care we take in the world. Journalism has always been at least partly about how people shape places and places shape people. After all, where is one of the fundamental questions that guides a journalist, along with who, what, when, why, and how. I'd argue that the best journalism is like a map. It shows you where you are in relation to others. It provides a sense of topography, a glimpse into a new world, or a better understanding of a familiar one. Ideally, journalism helps citizens and communities discover where they are so that they can better discover where they're going and better decide where they want to go. So here's an example of what I mean. I did a radio story a few years ago that involved this building here, 710 Montgomery Street, in San Francisco's financial district. It's now, what else, a small plates restaurant, of course, but it has buried inside of it part of the story for why San Francisco, of all places on earth, is the gay Mecca. 70 years ago, this building was the Black Cat Cafe. And this guy, Jose Sarria, would dress in drag and host a cabaret show. And this is what it sounded like.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And once again, I welcome you on behalf of the working staff of the Black Cat.
His show drew people from all over the country.
Where are you from, sir?
Estabula, Ohio.
Ohio? Did you hear about the Black Cat in Estabula, Ohio? You did? Isn't that bad? My goodness.
And so he would do this show, and he would expose tourists from all over the place, including Estabula, Ohio, I'm not sure where that is, to a sort of proto-gay rights movement that he was leading single-handedly from this cafe, mostly by way of opera tunes. He would change the words in arias and turn them into funny gay pride anthems. I actually tracked this guy down, Jose Sarria. That's what I do as a reporter. He is in his 80s now, and I begged him to sing a bit of one of his old standards for me.
Girl on a motorbike looks like a diesel dyke from Rigoletto.
And so with songs like that, Jose basically gave birth to the gay rights movement at this cafe before it had ever existed in San Francisco. And voila, you have a gay Mecca. He could get away with this here because, strangely, of a local post-prohibition tax policy. You see, back then, most cities in the US regulated their bars with a sort of morals police. But in San Francisco, a law dating back to the repeal of Prohibition ordained that bars would be regulated by the tax board, not a morals police. And they didn't care what went on in those bars as long as they made money. So voila, the Black Cat was born and San Francisco became a gay Mecca. So that story, locked in the walls of 710 Montgomery Street, that is one example of these narrative landscapes that I'm talking about. How the peculiarities of one place and its local tax policy created a cafe that allowed a man to help change the world. And this is the sort of story geology that I'm talking about. The cool thing about it is that you can pretty much play this game anywhere. Pick any random place, mine it with your storytelling pickaxe, and you will find stories buried there. Take this nondescript down at the heels block of O'Farrell Street in San Francisco. It turns out that once upon a time, this was actually a very swanky part of the city, and this couple and their daughters lived there at 920 O'Farrell Street. Now it's a movie theater multiplex. But in the 1870s and 80s, it was a mansion, and their daughter wrote a book about life on that block. She describes listening to organ grinders and opera singers walk down the streets in the evening, and she describes adventures with her neighbor, who actually was a girl named Alice B. Toklas. If any of you are familiar with her, she went on to become Gertrude Stein's muse and the namesake of a certain kind of brownie. She describes watching her father swing a live chicken at Passover over the dinner table and sacrifice. But that whole world that woman described in her book changed drastically and forever in 1906 when an earthquake struck while she was on a trip to Europe. In her book, she tells the story of coming to the street a few weeks later and not being able to find her house. It had totally disappeared. But that's not the only thing that happened on that plot of earth. Later, the same spot was the site of a Cadillac dealership where some of the first civil rights protests occurred in San Francisco. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. But just imagine you have this one place, earthquake, Alice B. Toklas, civil rights protest, right on this one spot, all of these stories layered on top of each other. And now, there's no evidence of any of it. It's just a movie theater. People walk by this street and they would never know any of these stories are buried here. Which brings me to the vision that I had in the desert. Remember, I told you I would tell you that story. So I was driving through this desolate stretch of Utah where almost nobody lives, and I saw a house off in the distance. And I was really hot and a little delirious, and I couldn't stop wondering who the hell lived in that house and why. And I had this intense urge to click on that cabin, like you would click on a hyperlink. I had been sitting at a computer for too long, and I wanted to hear the stories that were buried inside of that cabin. And back then, 10 years ago, this was a ridiculous idea. It was impossible. The world is not made of hyperlinks. You cannot click on places to learn more about them. But now, thanks to many of you in this room, thank you, it is not such a crazy idea. With smartphones and tablets, we can click on a landscape, or maybe tap is a better verb these days, to learn more about it using augmented reality and QR codes and GPS and smart maps and all the other cool stuff that we're talking about today. But these applications are, of course, still evolving, and they still have their limitations. If we were driving through Utah right now and we clicked on that cabin, what would we get? Well, we'd get some cool Wikipedia articles, some factoids about the desert, some suggestions of restaurants, some user-generated content. And that is very cool. It would blow my great-great-grandfather, who rode on his mule, it would blow his mind. But a place is more than that. There are also the human dramas, the personal and political and economic forces that shape a place and its people. And these are the sorts of stories that journalists tell every day and continue to tell, and there are archives full of them, and we're continuing to add more to those archives. But right now, a lot of those archives are locked up. And what I want to do is unlock them and drape them onto the landscape to be able to click on them or tap on them and help make meaning out of the world. Now, there are some really interesting projects emerging right now that are already exploring this area. I'll just do a shout out to some folks that I've been watching who I think are doing really cool stuff. Broadcaster, Mondo Window, Layer, History Pin, Look Back Maps, Sepia Town, many more that I don't have time to mention here. Last year, I spent a year at Stanford as a night journalism fellow to try out my own experiment. I worked with folks at the design school and the spatial history project in the history department and created a piece that was showcased at a locative media conference called City Centered. This is how it worked. I went to that block on O'Farrell Street in San Francisco where the Cadillac dealership was, and I did my reporter thing, research and interviews with people who had lived and worked on the block over the years. And I'm not a programmer, so I used a sort of analog version of augmented reality. Every place there was a story, I tied a red balloon. And each balloon had a phone number displayed to it, next to it. And you could call that number and hear a little story about that place, like this story.
This building across the street, of course, was Donnelly Cadillac, the first car dealership picketed for not offering equal opportunities for people. It was an early civil rights thing, and they actually marched for days.
My grandmother, I'm sure, was there. She was involved with the civil rights movement in the 60s. Later in life, like in the 80s, my father actually bought a Cadillac from that actual dealership. I'd like to think there was some significance in him buying it there. You know, black people felt if they bought Cadillacs, that's where they do it at, but I'm not sure.
And so people listened to stories like this, and then they would move to the next balloon and call another one, and then more people would say, what the hell are those guys doing? And they would start to stop and listen, and I started getting emails from folks telling me about the stories that they knew about that street. One woman wrote to say that after the experience, she saw the world with new eyes because it made her wonder what else might have happened on other nondescript streets that she may have passed through. And by the way, just a note, a word about this experiment and its use of audio. I think audio is actually a really perfect medium for location-aware technology, and I'm not just saying that because I've spent my entire career in radio, though I do think that's a nice benefit. But consider this whole concern over distracted driving and media multitasking. I will point out that if you are listening to stories as opposed to reading them, it reduces your risk of accidents and tripping over the world while you're trying to explore it with your gizmo. Okay, so the final chapter. Since my red balloon experiment, I've been having conversations with others in public radio and in the journalism world, and it's clear that there is this huge archive that we are adding to every day of wonderful stories with a sense of place, waiting to be connected to the landscape and clickable to curious people. And that's led to new projects. I'm working on a collaboration right now with something called StoryCorps. If you're a public radio junkie, you may already have heard of StoryCorps. Basically, it's an oral history project where you bring a relative or a loved one to a StoryCorps recording booth, which is actually a tricked out Airstream trailer. And you interview them about their life. And these interviews are often amazing. They make you cry or laugh out loud. StoryCorps has gathered more than 30,000 conversations over the last decade from across the country, and they're all archived at the Library of Congress. Some of them air on NPR each week. But there are thousands of other stories that they've gathered that few people have ever heard. Stories about places where people have lived and loved and made mischief and made love. And I'm working with StoryCorps to geolocate these stories. Right now we are doing that by hand, so if anybody has suggestions on how to automate that experience, let me know. And we're putting them on a map and we're unleashing them onto the world. Specifically, we will be unleashing them across Manhattan's Lower East Side on the first weekend in May. It's part of something called the Festival of Ideas for the New City. If you're in New York that weekend, come by or talk to me later and I can tell you more about it. What you'll be able to do is stroll around, click on the landscape with your smartphone or dial up the story on your cell phone if you don't have a smartphone, and you can hear stories like this one from East 6th Street, where Joe Del Sante grew up.
Okay, Dad, when and where were you born?
I was born in 1925, September 18th, on East 6th Street in Manhattan.
And what was your ethnic background?
What's that mean?
Where were your parents from?
Well, my parents were both born on the Lower East Side, but my grandparents on both sides were from Italy.
And so what was it like growing up in the Lower East Side?
Oh, it was fantastic. Plenty to do, plenty of things to see, plenty of people to play with, no money, and not too much food.
So when you were growing up, did you get into trouble?
Well, nothing serious, but we all got in trouble. You know, we always did something.
Like what?
Well, little things like beat the push carts for their pickles when the owners weren't looking.
I love that image of that guy pocketing a pickle from a push cart in 1935. And that's what I'll leave you with, Joe Del Sante's voice ringing in your ears about the pickles that he stole as a child. It's just one of the secret histories of a place that is waiting to be heard. If you have questions about how to find and unleash these stories, or stories like this onto your projects, or if you just want to find out more about any of the places that I've been talking about just now, come find me or click on me here. I'm always looking for people to collaborate with and new technologies to experiment with. And because every good story has a moral, my closing thought, as location-aware technology continues to break new ground, we don't know exactly where it's going to go. It's going to go in a lot of really exciting places. But I think what's imperative is that storytellers, journalists, curators be part of that journey. Digital information is going to keep pouring onto our physical world, and we need to make sense of it, not just with keywords and category tabs, but with stories. They're the oldest tool that we humans have for making sense of things, and there are stories everywhere. You just need to know how to find them. Thank you.